Hello, I'm Heidi Kuhn, your host of the Los Altos History Show. We're going to be talking about the Ohlone civilization, the native people who lived in this land we know as Los Altos, hundreds, possibly thousands of years ago. With me are Linda and Mark Hilkema. Linda and Mark are both native Los Altans, both archaeologists, with a keen interest in the Ohlone culture. Welcome, Linda and Mark.
Thank you.
Hi, Heidi.
How are you? Well, how did you get interested in all this, in archaeology, and in particular, the Ohlone people?
Well, it's a long story, so I guess you have to go back to the early beginnings as we would as archaeologists. I think my interest started primarily because my parents were avid outdoors people, and so I spent a lot of time outdoors learning about the natural landscape just on my own. And then interestingly enough, while attending Foothill College, I enrolled in an anthropology course and found that I was quite fascinated by Native American culture. And shortly thereafter, I moved to Humboldt, went to Humboldt State University, and began learning about Native American culture there from the Indians themselves. And that was very useful for me to appreciate the culture. Shortly thereafter, I went to San Jose State and finished my degree and became employed as an archaeologist some 12 years ago now. It seems like just yesterday.
And Linda, how about you?
Well, my beginnings are somewhat similar to Mark's. My parents were also avid outdoors people and avid historians. We visited archaeological sites all over the western states. When I was in San Jose State, majoring in psychology, I had the opportunity to take a field school in archaeology. There was an excavation going on in Santa Cruz, and I thought, well, this is pretty local, I'll take the course. And within the second day of being in the field, I knew immediately that I wanted to be an archaeologist, and now I work for the federal government, and I do it for a living.
It's so unique having a husband-wife archaeology team here in Los Altos, both being Los Altans by native.
That's how we met.
Well, tell us just briefly how that occurred. You met in the field?
We met at that excavation in Santa Cruz, actually. I was an undergraduate student, and Mark was a graduate student. And we both saw each other in the field, and that was it.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, Mark, tell us a little bit about how far back you were able to trace the culture of the Ohlones here in the Los Altos area.
Sure, certainly. We don't know exactly when the first Native Americans came to North America. Many of the Indian people themselves believe they've always been here, and hence, came from the earth here itself. We do know that around 15,000 years ago, there was a change in the climate where it began to heat up a little more, and much of the Western North America's glacial ice sheet began to melt. And as it melted, sea level rose and caused a great deal of environmental change. And from about that time, around 10,000 years ago, we start seeing some of the early archaeological sites in California. In fact, I've had the opportunity to work on a site in Santa Cruz that goes back to 10,000 years. No doubt we'll find older sites, but as yet we haven't. So, but we do have concrete evidence that they were here 10,000 years ago. And as the environment continued to change, the people adapted to it, so that by about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, when sea level pretty much reached the level it is now, the environment began to stabilize, and the people began to adapt from it thereon, and until we would see them at the time of European contact.
I see, I see. Linda, do you have anything to contribute to that? Yeah, well, I also wanted to know how far back, I think more specifically in my question, would be what made these people unique? What made them different than other, say, indigenous cultures or groups that lived here along the coast, say, for instance, or the northern Miwok tribes?
I think the people here in the Bay Area were in a unique position of proximity to the ocean and its vast array of coastal resources. And they were sort of middlemen to people on the interior, say people on the other side of the Sierra Nevada. We know for a fact that these people were middlemen in a lot of exchange networks from other parts of California between coastal trade and the interior.
I see. And how about the beautiful fruits and nuts that are so indigenous to this area, or unique to this particular region?
Well, this is a very resource-rich area with its estuary of the bay and the oak woodlands of the valley, and then you've got the hills with its varieties of resources, so that the people here developed a technology that allowed them to continue to adapt on the land and have time to perfect their economic exchange systems. It was a very rich habitat. That made them fairly unique. In fact, this area had one of the highest population densities of Indians in North America.
Really?
So it tells you how rich it was ecologically.
They were very attracted to this particular area,
Yeah.
just like the modern-day Silicon Valley.
That's true.
Exactly. That's exactly right, actually.
Really, really. Well, Linda, tell me, can you paint a picture of a typical day? What was it like for a typical family growing up here several hundred years ago?
Well, a typical village, their activities would be dominated or dictated pretty much by the season of the year that they were in. For example, much of the fall would be spent harvesting resources such as acorns, which become ripe in late September, and the harvesting of anadromous fish such as steelhead, which are spawning at this time of year. It was a time of preparing for winter, of very intensively gathering resources for the long winter months ahead. The winter would be spent primarily indoors, spent with other family members. This was a time that was spent mending tools, hunting kits, mending your bows, reworking your arrow points, mending your baskets, doing all those kinds of activities that one might save for the long winter months. The spring, families would disperse out and gather the newly erupting grasses and shoots and plant materials.
You say families, you mean everyone was involved, not only the
just
children, the women, but
pretty much everyone that we know.
Really?
As far as we can tell, everyone was involved. Spring would send their families out to gather the new shoots and all of the new plants that were emerging, as well as for hunting and replenishing the meat supplies, which would probably run fairly low in the wintertime, although they did some hunting in the winter as well.
So you would say they were a people who were very sensitive to their environment, and certainly the seasonal climatical changes.
They had to be. Yeah. And just to wrap up, the summer would be spent harvesting a lot of the grass seeds and other plants that would be ripe in the summertime. As well, they would also burn the landscape in the summertime. It would burn the grasslands to ensure that the next year's grasses would come back even fuller and more lush.
So this was passed on from generation, say, to generation.
That's right.
That's interesting. Well, in order to give you a more in-depth focus on specifically what Linda and Mark have shared with us this evening, earlier this week we were able to go out on locations to two parks in Los Altos, Rancho San Antonio and the Redwood Grove along Adobe Creek, very close to the site of the archaeological dig that Mark mentioned, begun 20 years ago. We also met with John Kelly, the Los Altos city naturalist, who taught us about teaching the educational kits that are available to the students. So let's take a look at that tape now. What was the woman's role 700 years ago within the Pahone tribe?
Pahorone.
Pahorone.
The women performed a variety of roles, mostly the processing of vegetal foods, the collecting and gathering of plant materials for clothing and basketry, and for food. Processing acorns was predominantly a woman's role, although the men would help with the gathering as far as helping to shake the acorns from the trees. But the actual processing, the grinding and the leaching, that was predominantly a woman's occupation, as well as, of course, child rearing was predominantly done by the women.
We're here at the Redwood Grove along the Adobe Creek. Mark, what do you know about this site? Is there any evidence of civilization in this area?
Yes, actually there is. Several years ago I worked on an archaeological site just up the stream, and we found that the site dated back 3,000 years ago. Certainly there are older sites, but this is a fairly old site for this area. And from the remains in the site, we discovered that the stream here, Adobe Creek, was a sort of natural corridor from the foothills to the bay shore. And along this corridor, as you go through the different ecological zones on the way down to the bay, the Indian people were able to obtain a wide variety of plant and animal resources, such as fish like steelhead trout that would migrate up the stream seasonally, as well as a variety of plant and other materials that they could use, including rock materials for their stone tools and mortars and pestles. We find that streams like this formed a very rich regional area that could support the people for quite a number of years.
Mark, tell us about the Adobe Creek. What are the similarities? What was it like then?
Certainly. This is a seasonal stream, and so obviously in the springtime and winter months, there's a great deal more water flow. In fact, when the water began to flow rapidly, much like it is now, that would be when the steelhead trout would migrate upstream. And that would be the time that the local Ohlone people would focus their activities on fishing, among other things, around the stream. And so they could predict from year to year when these seasonal abundances would occur and form their settlements around them to obtain them.
So was there abundance of fishing then? What type of fish did you find in the Adobe Creek?
Actually, steelhead trout were one of the primary resources that the people went after because they were so abundant at one time. Also, there were various minnows and smaller fish species that they would get, and they had a variety of fishing techniques to obtain them, and it's very fascinating to learn their methods. They were very ingenious in their methodology. They would have several techniques which would include using basket traps to trap the fish as they migrate upstream. They could also spear them with bone-tipped harpoons. They would also use soaproot, which is a bulb that grows around here. They would pound the soaproot in streams like this, and it had a poison in it that would stun the fish, and the fish would float to the surface, and the people could obtain them that way very easily. And evidently, the poison that's in the soaproot didn't affect the people when they ate the fish, which is very interesting.
So what has happened to these old fishing techniques? Why were they not passed down throughout generations?
Actually, many of these techniques are still in use in various tribal communities throughout California. Around here, the people quit doing that primarily because the steelhead no longer migrate up these streams, and that's largely due to development more recently and logging practices of the past.
We're here with John Kelly today, Los Altos naturalist. John has developed a California Indian Study Guide kit. John, can you tell us a little bit about the artifacts that you have gathered here?
Sure. Actually, in the kit, only a couple of things are actually artifacts. There's a pounding rock and pounding bowl that are artifacts from a local dig that was done on the creek near here at Redwood Grove.
Interesting.
And the other artifact is a cooking stone that was in that dig too. The rest of this stuff is all replicas. They're things that I've made to show the children some hands-on things that they can play with and actually use in their classroom. Oh, with the exception of this. This is another artifact, an obsidian arrow point.
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Oh, look at that. Now they actually use these in terms of the hunting.
Mm-hmm. That would have been attached to the end of an arrow.
Uh-huh.
It could have been used for hunting.
Oh, very interesting.
The other things are replicas. They're things that I've made. I'll show you a couple things that are in here. These are black walnut shell dice with pine pitch inside with abalone decorations that would have been used for a gambling game.
A gambling game back then? Oh, how interesting. Now, how did they use these in forms of dice?
They would be used like dice. They would be thrown onto a basket, and if they landed up or down, points would be scored accordingly. And then often many possessions were gambled on these games, and the children weren't usually allowed to play these games because they were gambling.
Oh, try my luck. There you go.
And then there's another set of gambling implements here. These are gambling staves. It'd be a game played similarly. You'd drop them onto a basket and they'd land up or down and you'd score points accordingly.
How interesting. There is any age limit in terms of what children could participate?
I don't know how old they were when they were allowed to play, but again, it was an adult thing.
Very good. Thank you.
I also have in the kit a clapper stick that's an instrument that would have been used for ceremonial purposes, and it makes a clapping noise when it's shaken by itself.
Interesting. Takes a little bit of talent here.
Yeah.
It's all in the wrist action. There you go. Very good.
And then a dew-claw wrap that's made all of deer parts. These are the toenails of a deer. This is a deer antler, and then the leather is made out of deer skin too.
Where have you collected these from?
I got those from somebody that's involved with our history society who got them from hunting, some people that hunt.
Fabulous. Now this is what referred to as the mortar and pestle.
A mortar and pestle, or a pounding bowl with a pounding rock that would be used for pounding acorns.
And is this the type of food that the Aloni's ate?
The Ohlone ate a lot of different kinds of animal and plant food, but Ohlone, strongly in their diet, figured acorns because they were so prevalent and they were a good food with a high protein and fat content.
In talking to Linda, Mark, and John this past week, we became naturally very curious about some of the items and artifacts that the Ohlone civilization actually traded. Linda and Mark, could you explain a little bit about what was representative of those times?
Sure, actually. Some of the items I brought here are from the local archaeological site here in Los Altos, and others are from nearby sites. Some of the things that the people traded in this area were these shell beads. These are from Olivella shells, and they show up on the coast of San Mateo and Santa Cruz County. And the people would trade for those because they would use them as money. They had an exchange system which did use money and had values, much like our own.
With shells?
Yes, the shell was the medium.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
The amount of labor that went into producing the bead gave it its value.
Really? So in terms of, I don't know if the camera can pick this up, but some of the holes, the size of the holes or the quality of the shell determine the value.
Exactly.
That's right.
How interesting.
The workmanship made a big deal of difference. And another thing they would trade for from the coastal people are these abalone shell pieces. They would get shells from the coast to carve pendants out of for ornaments, for ceremonial purposes as well as decorative purposes. And in exchange, the people on the coast would get materials from the people of Los Altos, such as certain stone materials, plant foods. The people on the coast also had a lot of seafood, which I think the people here liked a lot. We find a lot of the shells in the archaeological sites.
Now, Linda, was this used for jewelry or pendants, or they're so beautiful, the abalone shells?
They are, they really are. They were used for a variety of things, as ornaments. They would weave them into some of their ceremonial regalia, their capes, a lot of their shawls and feathered capes. They were also used a lot in basketry. They would weave some of these smaller beads into their baskets, more or less as sequins, as well as dangle some of the abalone pendants off
with the monetary supply.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Right.
So they were ornamental in many different ways, on clothing and in baskets as well.
Would that indicate one's wealth, say, so to speak, if they were adorned with?
Yes, frequently. Actually, that's one of the questions we have as archaeologists, because we see that not only do the artifacts change in style through time, the amounts that we find with the people change through time. So we do see that there is differences in wealth and status within the community, which is interesting. You know, it's true of human societies all over the world.
Now, say for a comparison to the ancient Egyptian cultures, were the people buried with some sort of ceremonial regalia or with the types of stones to take to the afterlife?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Linda and I have both worked on many archaeological sites in this area where we frequently find some of the burials will have a variety of artifacts with them because they did believe they could take them with them in the afterlife. In fact, the afterlife was a journey, and they needed these tools to go with them.
Really? So they accompanied them?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Oh, that's very
Different people
interesting.
were buried with different objects. Sometimes you'll find people covered in beads. and other burials will not have beads, but they'll have pipes, or they'll have mortars and pestles, or other types of tools.
That were important to them in their
Probably
particular
so.
lifetime. Very interesting. Mark, tell us a little bit more
Sure.
about some of these other artifacts.
Another item that was exchanged to this area was obsidian, which is used for making arrowheads.
Now, we saw this out on
That's
Adobe
right.
Creek.
That's right. John Kelly had some of these.
Right.
This material doesn't occur around here, of course. It's a volcanic glass, and so they had to exchange for it from people that were much farther away.
So up in the Mount Lassen, Mount Shasta areas.
We find obsidian here that comes from as far away as Casa Diablo and Mono Hot Springs, east of the Sierra Nevadas. So we know they had an extensive trade network. And we also find another type of stone called chert, which is this material here. This is local. You can find this in the streams around here. And the Indians would make arrowheads out of this as well. This is a chopping tool for cutting down trees and such. They would use it as a hand axe. This chert is locally available, as I mentioned, but it's much harder to work than the obsidian. So they valued the obsidian a great deal more and would buy it with the beads that they had.
So again, it was all based on how labor intensive it
Yes.
was to refine the raw material.
Right, and who could afford to get it?
That's right. That's right. So many different things would carry on to our modern day cultures.
I think that's
Absolutely.
the fascination, is that there is a connectedness between us as societies around the world. We have our roots in similar ways.
And just how it all evolves. Tell us a little bit more, Linda, what are these? I find these fascinating. Now, would these be some sort of drumsticks? I don't know.
These are bear, are they tibia? Or
Yeah, the fibula.
they're
from
fibula.
bear.
We think they're bear, and they're polished, they're perforate on the end, and sharpened and polished on the distal end. And we believe they were bone hairpins. Probably used by the women, I would believe, in their some sort of hairdo.
So we could
Bundle up there.
something
bundle
like
up
this, very
somehow.
elegant.
Yes, yes.
Very,
Yes.
how lovely. Well, now you mentioned the bears also were very prolific here in the Los Altos region, the grizzlies, so to speak, and I think you had mentioned.
Grizzlies, and they were very, very formidable to these people. They, as we mentioned before, they ate the same foods these people ate. They inhabited the same habitat. So the bear and the people were very much in competition with each other and had to learn to live in and around each other.
Now, you had mentioned the Franciscans and the Spaniards had many encounters which were documented
That's
with
right.
the
They
grizzly
certainly
bears.
did.
So they were very popular in this region really up until, what, a couple hundred years ago?
Actually, the last grizzly bear was seen in the Santa Cruz Mountains in the 1870s, so it's not that long ago.
They were
relatively.
around fairly late, yes.
Oh, very interesting. Well, I'm sure the local beautician, this will be a new item in great demand here.
That's right.
The bones, bare bones.
But no longer available. Yes.
Very hard to get.
Absolutely. Now, where can we find these items? Are they displayed anywhere currently in the Los Altos region? Say, if any of the viewers are interested in seeing these
That's a
items.
very interesting question you ask, because typically we do the archaeological work and very seldom do we have the opportunity to display them for the public. And that's what the value of this film is, for example, that we can show you these things. Frequently the archaeologists can refer to them. We know where they are and how to reference them. But we have yet to build the kind of museums around here that will handle this material. They're very delicate, very valuable, and very rare. It's important that we treat them with a great deal of respect. And I think that soon we'll see a time when we can do that, hopefully very soon.
Good, good. Well, drum up some interest here. I find this just all very fascinating. Now, Mark, tell me, you had mentioned also about the baskets that were very popular in this particular region. Do you have any pictures or photos
Yes,
that
I
I think
do.
we had?
Actually, it's interesting because, of course, baskets don't preserve in the ground, so there's very few of them that we have to reference to. There are none from the archaeological record, but we have a few that managed to preserve through time, many of which, interestingly enough, are in the Soviet Union.
My area of interest and
Well, evidently, in the 1740s to the 1770s, the Russians were in California quite a bit, going after the sea otter, as we all know. And while they were here, they collected ethnographic specimens to take back to Russia, where they are now. They have more of these things there than we have here.
Really? Now, is that along the Far Eastern region or in, say, St. Petersburg or the Hermitage? And
Oh, that's exactly right. Actually, these materials are kept at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, which I think is the Soviets' equivalent of our Smithsonian.
it is. So we hear.
A vast archive yet to be tapped.
May I see that?
Certainly.
Just a moment.
Actually, I forgot to mention, what's fascinating about this basket is that you can see it has many of these olivella shells woven into it. And they're woven in a pattern so that there's a design in it. And what you don't see is that there were formerly feathers in the basket as well. They have since decayed and you can't see them anymore. But it gives you an idea of how elaborate their artwork and basketry is. These people didn't develop pottery because they didn't need it. Pottery is very delicate and very labor intensive. These baskets here were woven to such a fine art that they could boil water inside them. They're watertight. That's quite an art to be able to do that. So they're very beautiful in their own way.
Well, the Russian traders I know came down through the California coast over to the Fort Ross regions and that area. So these were items actually that they traded.
That's exactly
back
right.
and forth and ended up over there. Very interesting, very interesting. Okay, well, Mark and Linda, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of these very interesting artifacts with us. We look forward to continuing the show and having you on, once again, sharing your area of expertise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. We've only given you a snapshot of the Ohlone civilization of yesterday. Thanks again, as we mentioned, to Mark and Linda for joining us. While we were taping a few days ago, Mark shared an Ohlone creation story similar to the biblical one. We thought it would be an excellent way to finish our discussion this evening of the Native Americans who occupied this land we call Los Altos. So goodbye from now, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
The Spanish missionaries, when they first came here, recorded a creation story for the Ohlone at Mission Santa Clara. And the story goes like this. The Ohlone told the priests that at one time the whole earth was covered with water, except for one small piece of land, and that piece of land had 3 people living on it. Actually, they were creature people, and they were the hummingbird, coyote, and eagle. And the eagle was sort of the spiritual messenger for the sun, and the Ohlone word for sun is esmen. And they talk about a time when the waters began to recede eventually, and Hummingbird told Coyote to go down the hill and see what was below, and so Coyote did. Coyote walked down the hill slope and found that there were trees and meadows and valleys below the mountain. And also, Coyote found somebody down there already and came back up to the top of the mountain and told Eagle and Hummingbird about all this. And Eagle said, well, that person down there, go down and talk to them and find out more. Coyote did. Coyote came back, said, it's a beautiful woman. This woman down here is very pretty. And Eagle said, well, that woman is to be your wife. And so Coyote went back down the hill, married this woman, and their first children became the original tribes that inhabited the area. And the mountain that was once an island in the sea was called Umanum. And in the Ohlone word, that means hummingbird. And to this day, Mount Umanum exists in the Loma Prieta Mountains, just south of here, bordering Santa Clara Valley.